Why don't we start our next session? This has become one of our, give it just 1 second here, but this has become one of our spokes favorites. And we invite some of our friends of the spokes community, all of whom are known quite well to everybody here. And we have a casual session where we go through privacy predictions for the next year. And I'm delighted to introduce our friends of Wirewheel, friends of Spokes. On the far left, Charlie Simon from Nike. We're going to have them do, as we always do, quick introductions to talk a little bit about your background. Shannon Yavorsky and Omer Tanay from Goodwin. And why don't we start with Shannon? And Shannon, do you mind doing a quick introduction, giving some background on yourself before we go into our privacy predictions?
Sure. Thanks, Jen. Thank you. Shannon, chair of Oryx Cyber Privacy and Data Innovation Team. I'm an English and Irish solicitor and practiced in the UK for about 12 years before moving to the US about 9 years ago, and cover all kinds of European and US legislation, building privacy programs, answering ad hoc questions and the like.
Awesome. And where are you based now, Shannon? Like what part of the country?
In San Francisco.
So they can hire you for California, Ireland, UK, anywhere.
Anywhere.
Cover the world.
Sure.
Cover the world. Okay. Charlie, over to you. A little bit of background on yourself.
A little bit of background. Hey, howdy. First and foremost, I'm not an attorney. I'm a technologist. Nike calls me a privacy architect, or the senior director of privacy architecture. Google called me a privacy engineer. 1,000 years ago, the NAI called me an intern. So, you know, that's where I approached the privacy game from. But no, I'm reformed ad tech, led a unicorn through the GDPR. If any of you know the IAB Europe Transparency and Consent Framework, I vice chaired the creation of that, served on the tech lab for it, went to Google, eventually led their hardware privacy review for devices and services. And I'm now at Nike building out both internal core systems for audit, access, user rights management, et cetera, and also evaluating vendor technology and shaping the sort of digital strategy of the company.
Awesome. Yeah, Charlie, it's a small job and you don't have the right background, but other than that, you know, all's good. Great. Thank you for joining us, Charlie. And Omer, how about a quick intro?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Omer Tanay, I'm a partner at Goodwin, the data privacy and cybersecurity group based in Boston. And before that, I was the IPP for about a decade, the Chief Knowledge Officer. And I'll just note that I have some shoe envy here because on that front, obviously, Charlie sort of beat us hand down, but I think it's not fair. I like the pink. I think one of my sons has that flavor.
I thought you meant my shoes. No, you meant Charlie's?
Yeah, yours are also.
Thank you, Omer. I really appreciate it. Well, so, okay, quick reminder on the format, very casual. We go around one by one. You can raise your hand. We're going to go through 3 privacy predictions. Generally speaking, they can be technological, policy, law, breach, international, national security, whatever sort of floats your boat. And we go around, you talk about you name your prediction, talk about it for a few minutes, and then we'll all have a quick chat about that one. So Charlie is latest or on the far end. Charlie, why don't we have you go first? What's your first privacy prediction for the year?
In the last 40 minutes, I've come up with I mean, this is a no-brainer, right? No federal law gets passed. We see further fragmentation in state space, competition thereof. We continue to see predominantly attorney general-driven enforcement actions. And California does remain pretty isolated in its designation of folks like Ashkan Soltani as like an actual DPA. But we will actually finally start to see at the state level real private rights. The BIPA stuff obviously was a solid indicator of what has to come in 2023.
That's okay. So a lot packed into your privacy prediction, but it's an important set of them. So start with no federal privacy law. Depressing. I think we would all probably agree. But what do you guys think about? What do you guys think about Charlie's prediction?
I think it's totally on point. As of last week, Iowa's governor signed the 6th state privacy law. And I think we're on track to hear about the other, how many other states are considering state privacy laws right now?
At
20?
least 5. At least 5.
Yeah, there's
More
a tracker.
Five are like, yeah, to pass this.
Yeah, lots. So I think that landscape is only going to get more complicated, and it's like the GDPRification of the US. They're all really similar, but slightly different, which makes it really challenging for businesses to comply. And I've talked to clients who say, oh, there's no way that this can continue. They can't do this to businesses. But then we started with a couple of state data breach notification laws, and now we have 50 different state data breach notification laws and Puerto Rico and Guam. So it's, it's anyone's guess.
And we're definitely getting some weird extraterritoriality of the states, which from a tech perspective is very hard to enforce, right? You look at things like IP addresses and how they inform how your business operates. They're stable at the country level. At the state level, they make no sense. What AT&T and Verizon and the universities do with your IP, nobody knows. So Utah, which has this new very serious nanny bill around social media and children's rights and parental access to all that stuff, we may see the responses to that be completely countrywide because they're not a good way to verify who is in Utah and when and who isn't.
That's a great point. Like the California Age Appropriate Design Code also.
Exactly.
Extraterritorial effect, I think, is going to have a lot of impact on companies outside of California.
Yeah, I agree with Shannon and Charlie on this. I think the federal law is unlikely to pass, unfortunately. On the one hand, we did have an informational hearing in the House just a couple of weeks ago to sort of restart the process. And as you all know, the law, the draft bill, the ADPPA, did pass out of committee in the House in last Congress by an overwhelming majority, 53-2, and would likely be easily voted up even now. Plus, one of the impediments, the obstacles in last Congress was the fact that the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, was opposed mostly because of her constituency in her state. The concerns about preempting California, although I think that the draft federal law is much stronger than California, including for California residents, but that was her position. Of course, the new speaker is also from California, but caters to different stakeholders. So it seems like he could perhaps support it and bring it to the floor. So it seems like there is a path for it in the House. However, and I think it's a big however, we started hearing sort of voices from the Republican side that actually they went too far with the private right of action in the existing bill. I think the Democrats really had an incredible opportunity to pass it with a private right of action in the last Congress. Right now, it's a Republican-controlled House. I'm not sure it flies anymore. And then on the Senate side, it's still the same logjam. Maria Cantwell, Chair Commerce Committee in the Senate, has been, and as far as we know, still is opposed. And Roger Wicker, who was a big champion of this legislation, he moved on to, I think, the Armed Services Committee, so replacing him as the ranking member is Ted Cruz. And I think the best we can say is that we don't know what his position on this is. So it doesn't look likely. At the same time, states are moving. I asked my sort of friend expert just before coming here how many state laws he expects to pass this year in 2023. Of course, I went first. He said 4 to 5.
Did he say what states?
He did actually. I'll look it up in a second. He slacked it to me, but I look it up at Montana, New Hampshire, Texas, actually, which
You got more excited about Texas than New Hampshire. What is that? What's up with that? You live in New Hampshire, right? Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but you know, 4 or 5 more state laws, that's formidable. And like Shannon said, they're not all exactly the same. Plus, if even one of them provides for, allows, you know, a private right of action, that's like going ballistic on this.
Yep. Okay. Well, that was a perfect summary. Shannon, you're up next. What's your first prediction?
The prediction. So I think there's going to be a lot around AI. I know we just talked about it a little bit, but I just think that's going to really trend up in this year, towards the end of this year. I get questions, I feel like every day, about new clients of ours who are wanting to incorporate some form of some generative AI feature into their platform, or launch a new service, and they want us to, quickly address all of the issues. And we're having to, like the Italian regulator, take a step back and say, hang on a second, we need to really think through this and what you need to think about in terms of the risks, because I don't think anyone's done a full summary of what the legal risks are for an organization incorporating that kind of technology into its platform and services, both from a contractual perspective in their terms of service, but also from a privacy perspective. What do you need to add to your privacy policy? Do you need to have just-in-time notices presented to users that describe the fact that there's an AI-powered feature? How do you describe, ChatGPT says it's a data processor in most circumstances. What are all the different circumstances in which the data is going to be used? So I think there are a lot of open questions that really haven't been fully resolved, and lots of principles in generative AI that are sort of antithetical to established core privacy principles like data minimization and storage limitation and the availability of individual rights with respect to the data that is informing the algorithm. So I think that's going to be something keeping privacy professionals busy, for the foreseeable.
Charlie, any reaction?
I completely agree. I also think, not an attorney, but the controller processor position on contracting with a company who's trained their model on the whole of the internet is fascinating. Like, what are your pass-on obligations to every user of the internet who you may have absolutely no relation with, but be operating a model that was based on the data they generated? Like, I think that's just like a mind-blowing realization that controller processor just blew up. Unless you're Italy and you're banning OpenAI, everyone's data is being processed.
But yeah, and that was why the discussion with Carolina was so fascinating. You're a pass-through processor of a lot of data, and it's hard for me to put my mental model on this. And in some ways, Shannon, it reminds me a bit of the blockchain, the crypto discussions. It's one of these things where ChatGPT right now, or the generative AI, is so cool, or people think it's so mind-blowing, they're just going ahead and using it. And everybody's sort of like, well, we'll figure it out later. And the reason I use that analogy is in the crypto window, I think you go to any of us or any privacy person, they'd say, well, you're recording a transaction publicly on a blockchain that can't possibly be undone or deleted. That does raise a bunch of GDPR issues. And yet 100% of people went ahead and did it anyway. It didn't block anybody from using any crypto technology, even when transactions were recorded publicly and couldn't be deleted. Right. And nobody in the world has done anything about it. You know what I mean?
Can I jump in here? So yeah. I actually think the analogy is apt, but it demonstrates that AI and this current trend dwarfs blockchain, because realistically nobody was using blockchain, and we scratched our heads and couldn't figure out what the business use case is. Of course, it was very much an investment type, and there were some investment sort of avenues, vehicles, I guess. but very little, like I can hardly remember what they were called, NFTs, all that. Yeah, people were talking about it, but it seemed a bit kind of detached from business realities. Here, like Shannon said, everybody is actually implementing it, for customer service, for sort of managing your internal databases, for chat. So I think this one is much more practical, operational, and therefore impactful.
I do agree with you. I think first of all, I agree with you. I think generative AI is different order of scale. It also affects so many broad parts of everything in a different way. I agree with you. But to be fair, blockchain and blockchain transactions were trillions of dollars. Well, it's more just that it happened. It was incompatible with some basic principles of privacy, and it affected nobody. Everybody did it, and it has never been a consequence. And I think that is in some ways affecting people's use right now for everybody of ChatGPT. I think people are just doing it. And it's sort of like, we'll figure it out later, and everybody's using it. So it's got to be okay. And they're not doing a deep analysis,
So on the one hand, I want to say that I think for the big companies, FANGs, the whatever the world, the ChatGPT, OpenAI, Bing, Sydney, well, Sydney was Bing, but just told to be bad. But if you're not reading Stratechery, you should. But like, on the one hand, I want to tell you that this is a boon to the big companies that are wildly regulated, right? Because this generative AI universe is counter to the entire GDPR. Imagine we are all like, I pay a subscription to leverage GPT-4. And I know that when I am teaching it to rewrite an email, on behalf of me as a member of the board of directors of a dog park, I know it's ridiculous, but I do. I tell it to adjust tone and whatever else. It's not just learning from me. It's learned and been trained on all of the data on the internet that they could get a hold of and scrape. Think about this, right? Under the GDPR, a public record posted by a newspaper about somebody who was convicted of a crime once upon a time in Spain can be requested for removal, not the article itself, but the index of it from Google. But this thing has scanned everything. It is not, if you wanted to assert a data subject deletion, like you wanted to a right to erasure, what is OpenAI going to do? Retrain their entire model, all of GPT-4 on everything minus that? Like, this is an opaque machine that's already created. You can't do that. I
agree. Haven't you kind of wanted to send in a a data subject deletion request to ChatGPT and just see what the heck happens? Like, what are they going to say?
Suddenly, I know like everything that was traceable on the internet, right? I could ask ChatGPT to go try and link my identities across multiple pseudonyms. Like, it breaks privacy.
I think this is your next research, technical research paper, Charlie. I think publishing what the heck happens when you do that, don't you think?
I'd need access to the underlying set in a large grant that doesn't exist right now.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that was a big prediction. Omer, I think you're up, right? What's your?
Yeah. So my first prediction is. Let's call it a focus on moral outrage. I feel that moral outrage is bubbling. We can actually feel it on this panel even. And it's being channeled through privacy to different sort of targets where I'm not sure that privacy is the right tool. I mean, I see the problems, but I'm not sure privacy is the right tool to address them. One way it manifests is with bans. So we saw the Italian DPA now ban 2 chatbots, very broadly used. And of course, the big one is the United States is debating for a while banning an app that's used by 150 million Americans. It's kind of mind-blowing to think about that. Do these services, apps, technologies raise problems? Hell yeah, like serious, grave social problems. But are they privacy problems? I'm not so sure. There are problems about content and safety and kids' safety and kids' access to all kinds of stuff. And, you know, kind of technological tools that we let unleash, maybe without sufficient checks. My sense is, and, you know, I've been in privacy for a long time. My sense is that privacy is kind of the tail that's wagging the dog here. But it's a tool that's available, so they're using it. I think another direction that we see this is with the push towards age verification. We see it actually in these cases with the Garante in Italy with the chatbots. But much broader than that, of course, California passed the Age Appropriate Design Code Act, and Instagram actually, Meta actually deployed third-party age verification partially as a response to the enforcement actions in Europe.
By the way, it's a weird technology. Have you seen that? And it's a little.
Yeah, I've seen it, and I have clients dealing with it on a daily basis. And the one thing I'll tell you is that it's incredibly privacy invasive.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean. It's a little weird to have your kid effectively have their face scanned.
Biometrics. So it runs against biometric laws. And also in many cases, hard IDs, like real sort of government issued IDs. So, you know, we grew up in an age when the internet was relatively anonymous or pseudonymous, right? You talked about sort of connecting the pseudonyms. Here, you need to identify yourself with an actual ID and with a biometric, a video or a photo, and you need to do it as an adult, right? To prove that you're not a kid. And not, this isn't like Disney sort of channel. So it's not child-directed sites. It's sites that may be used by kids or teens now, because it's not COPPA 13, it's Age Appropriate Design Code 18. So it includes porn sites and gambling sites, and you need to present a hard identifier in order to access as an adult. So I think, you know, again, look, I have kids and I have teens, and I'm terrified at the fire hose of garbage, you know, that they're being fed through different sources on the internet. But is the solution to that age verification and even privacy? I'm not sure. I don't think privacy is the problem. And if they need consent, including verifiable parental consent, you know, they'll get it because we'll give it to them, right? And I won't keep my kids off the internet. And the third sort of context for this, I think, is ad tech, which is always everybody's favorite topic. And, you know, this has been going on for years, of course, but we see it coming to a head, like with the platform rules, with the recent FTC decisions on health-related information and BetterHelp, GoodRx, lookalike audiences and social media. So it reaches the breaking point. And again, will the solution, like a much more consolidated environment, be better than the malady? I'm not sure. So I would put these together as under moral outrage, which is creating use of privacy tools that isn't always fit for purpose.
That's great. All right.
Well, I just want to chime in on the age verification tech. You know, we were probably all coming up under maybe COPPA or just before COPPA, right? And the point then, whether you're ad tech or a publisher, was, okay, we actually don't want to know your age, right? We don't want to know your age and we don't want to be child directed, and then we're safe. Now we've morphed past COPPA 2 into this universe where we have to know your age, or somebody has to know your age, and they have to be verifiable enough to tell us. Those somebodies who are doing this biometric recognition, ingest of licensure data, ingest of whatever data, they are a permanent, enormous breach risk. Right? I was subject to the Chinese attack on the US credentialing service because I had interned in the Senate and, twice, right? Suddenly, every child of every parent who has to go through this crazy thing will be part of some major database that is breachable, right? We are creating out of this moral outrage more risk. And we're also gatekeeping the internet. And it's not you gatekeeping the internet for your children. It's states making these laws on behalf of your parental obligations. It's a totally dynamically different area.
And I think the worst thing is that the kids will get to the internet because you will allow them, but now some third party or first party will have your identity information.
And I'll just offer, I don't think it's the case that these folks have finally broken the one rule of the internet that's still true. The children will figure out how to get to it with or without your permission, just full stop. So now it's a question of, is the children's information stored by a bunch of people who probably pose a breach risk?
Shannon, any reaction?
Omer, I love that your prediction is moral outrage. That's amazing. I also agree that the fire hose of garbage that our children see on like all the different platforms, it's a really good point that is privacy the way to fix it. And I agree, I'm not so sure. Even with AI, privacy is not the only angle. There are a million different angles. And I think this is what's making our response that it's very complex in terms of what laws apply. And the toolbox is not as advanced as the services that are available, I think is one of the issues that, that stokes my moral outrage. Like we just don't have the right tools to tackle these things. And
Are you telling me that you're skeptical of the people who interviewed the TikTok CEO being sufficiently advanced on tech enough to actually regulate?
Well, that Charlie, on that note, that was one of my first predictions, which is I do think we'll hit a year where non-US or people start at least focusing on transfer of your data to non-US. That said, like, I almost every time we've had the commission on, I talked to Bruno, I've talked to Carolina about this, we've talked to the Irish regulator. There's just no I know they mentioned and they talked about it today that there are now investigations going on transfer of data to either China or Russia. I think there's got to be something on that just to at least put a marker in the sand that a data transfer at that level to these other countries matters. Like why Max Schrems is not bringing cases about this, I have no idea. Why it's not on the headline, I have no idea. I do share your view that hearing, I think, did nobody any good in the privacy protection world if you were worried about China. In my view, the questions seemed really confused, technically and technologically. There was no way for the folks who were up asking the questions to talk about what I'm guessing were intelligence briefings or something. So it was like they were hamstrung because they couldn't talk about what they knew. I suspect they knew more. And then you layer into it questions that sounded, really off, in the way they were being asked. And the whole thing ended up, I think, giving a really bad impression of what the issue is with data sharing through an app when it's not the public posts that I think most regulators or members of Congress or government is worried about. Those are public. It's the telemetry, the location data, the combination of the logging, telemetry, and location data as tied to a device. That's the scary part, right? And nobody's focused on that issue.
And here's the thing, that telemetry point, which I completely holistically agree with, the ability to target an individual to determine the where and the when and the how, right? That point came up way back when Travis Kalanick was still running Uber. Yeah. Remember when they had the God mode or God's eye, I think is what they called it, and they could see where every reporter that they were monitoring was moving, right? This is not unique to TikTok. What's unique to TikTok is kids love it. and it is owned by a Chinese government entity, but that APIs are disclosing your location at great granularity via, your phone's capacity for GPS monitoring and elsewhere. That's not new. And that's not super regulatable right now, unless you want to shut down all of the iOS App Store and Google's Play Store. So I would challenge you on this one. Under what basis would we enact a data transit rule? I know why the commission can do it.
Oh, yeah, I don't think it'll be a US thing necessarily, Charlie, because I don't think any of us think there's going to be a national data protection law. I do think there's at least an argument you could do it under an export control theory, depending on what they know, which I know nothing about. And I suspect if it gets something where they can't get a statute out there, it wouldn't shock me if it went down an export control theory of some kind at this point. But I think the more likely path where it comes up is actually from Europe in the first instance, in terms of data transfers being sort of examined to non-US parts of the world. I don't know. Do you all have any reaction?
I mean, Justin, I share your astonishment that there's nothing in place to restrict or limit the transfer of personal information from the US to basically anywhere. It's really, it's been part of the conversation, but it's never, I've recently had clients in China asking me, are you sure there's nothing to restrict our transfer? And I'm like, no, you can also talk to our export control lawyer about whether there's non-personal information that we need to have a deeper conversation about. But in terms of personal information, sorry, it's a free-for-all.
Can I offer that ironically, and Nike does business all over the globe, there absolutely is a law in China regulating the transport of their data to the United States.
Yeah, and standard contractual clauses and all the rest of it.
All sorts of audit requirements. If you are exporting that data needs to be reviewed by a division of their Air Force, I believe. Speculating a little bit there. I'm not kidding.
I'll be a bit of a contrarian on this one. As you know, I think I was never a sort of a believer in the European data transfer system and framework. I think it's never really worked, and it wasn't feasible from, the day it was set forth. It was outdated back in 1995, like under the directive, not to mention the GDPR. It's all, trying to kind of patch and try to find sort of temporary fixes to a much more fundamental problem, which is that data really can't be contained geographically, because that's not the way the technology works. So I think my 2 cents, if somebody asked, would be for the United States and other countries to not try to replicate data transfer restrictions, and in fact, for Europe to walk them back, scale them back, certainly with respect to the United States, but also more generally. I think that framework is just not workable, feasible, practical, or realistic.
That's a contrary point. I'll definitely do that. Well, so we're going to run out of time. I wanted to do 3, but I'd like to do at least one more round through this group and get one more privacy prediction for the year, just to make sure we do it. This time we'll go this way. Omer, you get the first. What's your next privacy prediction for the year?
So I think increasingly we will see less of the headline grabbing enforcement actions like we've seen a lot of over the past few months, a couple of Meta cases and Google Analytics cases everywhere. And what I think will become of these cases is that they'll get caught up in the web of litigation and be ingested by that for the foreseeable future for years. And as we all know, some of these cases are quite complex. They're not slam dunks by any stretch of the word. The Meta case, I think, is a good example. There was, there were profound differences between the data protection authorities on which way it should land. I think the disagreement is very clear. Personally, I think some of the legal argumentation in that decision, in those decisions, was weak, and I think it'll emerge in litigation. So I think this will be sort of the start of a period of more litigation and less enforcement.
Reactions? Charlie, Shannon?
I don't know. One of my other potential predictions was actually we were finally going to start seeing digital non-native companies and mid-cap companies really actually see more aggressive regulatory intervention. So that prediction kind of runs counter to your interpretation. But looking back to Sephora, right? Granted, Sephora turns out is part of LVMH, which makes them massive. But ignoring like just that, Sephora was a relatively small fine, but it was a shot across the bow from a state AG on the basis of regulation that was about to be completely eclipsed. And it was in the CPG sector, right? We're going to see more of that. Companies that aren't named Google and Microsoft and Alphabet and Apple are going to start, and sorry, Meta, they're going to start getting sued too, because the bottom line is right now we just have a universe of enforcement action and regulation and private rights that only looks at the very biggest companies, which accounts for next to nothing in terms of where your data is actually stored and potentially stored most securely.
Shannon?
I'm seeing in the increased legislative sort of regulatory and enforcement environment in Europe that it's creating this sort of balkanization of the GDPR in Europe. It was meant to harmonize laws across Europe, but with the enforcement in each regulator sort of acting in the interest of their own country and informed by everything that's going on there. The law is sort of diverging in many different ways. And I think a great example of that is with the UK ICO. We were talking about this earlier, whether the UK ICO's sort of more business-friendly approach to the GDPR will one day impact its adequacy decision. I don't know, but I think, in enforcement I've seen is like ramping up. You look at the charts of enforcement by the regulators in Europe from 2018 to today, and it's an incredibly steep line.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with you, Omer. I think I agree with the panel. I'd say my sense of it, just having sort of worked with a bunch of law firms as well, Charlie, is there are a lot of enforcement letters going out. I think very few people are actually litigating these things. Like you get the complaint, you say you did something wrong, they're accepting the fine, they're settling, and they're like fixing stuff as fast as humanly possible because you don't want to be the next named company in something public. But I do think there's more of that going on than there was in the past. And, I share your view on that too, Shannon. All right, your next privacy prediction.
Next privacy prediction is the impact of the geopolitical climate on privacy. So I think TikTok is a great example of that. Is it really about TikTok, or is it really about the US-China relations? And I'm seeing that with other companies that are under regulatory focus scrutiny right now, and how those relationships and whether countries are going to become more sort of protectionist and how that impacts privacy legislation, regulation, and enforcement, I think is something to watch for this year.
It's a good one. I agree with you. Reactions? No agreement?
Balkanization of the internet has been happening for several years, and it's only getting weirder. I completely agree.
Charlie, your last privacy prediction?
I'm going to go bold here. I had a couple of options. We talked about a few of them. I think we are actually going to start seeing, and this might be alarming and should be alarming, we're going to start seeing the intersection of malware and cybercrime intersect on the data breach around data that is regulated, but not necessarily potentially sensitive. So that's to say, if you work with companies, or if you have companies that have data that is improperly stored, or they don't have a legal basis for its storage, and cyber criminals actually get a hold of it, just because it's not my social security number, if I'm European, it does matter that you have that. And if you have no basis for the consent, and people can infer that, a cyber criminal may try to extort you on the basis that revealing that set will have you in a regulatory action.
I get it. Omer, Shannon, anything on this one? It's an important one.
Yeah, I think that it'll be interesting to see how the data breach landscape evolves this year with increased regulation and focus on ransomware attacks and the obligation to disclose those. I think ransomware might be on the decline, but maybe a little bit
Uptick.
up. You
A
think?
huge uptick. Yeah, all the projections for the next few years are cybercrime is going to jump into the trillions of dollars over the next decade.
Still profitable, I guess.
All right. Well, I'm gonna first of all, I want to thank each of our phenomenal panelists. These were great. And I'm gonna take the moderator's privilege to have two final predictions. The first one is I see an explosion in class action litigation around privacy coming. And we had a really interesting panel on the healthcare enforcement cases. We had a speaker from Ronnie Sullivan from the FTC and a speaker from HHS. And the thing that really caught my ear is almost all of the phraseology from the FTC, and I'm paraphrasing here today, was around the concept that sharing of data to a third party is a data breach, and that they're using that terminology in almost every phrase. It's not a privacy violation, it's a data breach. And already we're watching a whole slew of folks get these complaints that are third-party data sharing class action cases on different theories of data breach. And I think if that takes hold, you get a couple of judges. It doesn't take very much for the entire plaintiff's bar to get spun up. And the private right of action stuff that we've been talking about, Omer, is going to be like peanuts, because third-party pixel technology, there's over 1 million companies using, every one of them. And you add in click tracking technology inside a product, which, you've seen some of the class action cases are calling those wiretapping, right? So you combine all that and you start getting a little momentum around it, you're going to have a broad class action bar just bringing data breach cases on what is the use of normal ad tracking technology. And some of these cases, I think, could go quickly. And if the FTC keeps pushing this as a data breach theory, it kind of validates the theory. So I don't know. Do you guys have
just quick reaction? BetterHelp was the first time I believe the FTC enforced that health breach notification rule. It's a bit specific for personal health records. But I take your point, and I think it's been going on in California for a few years, the attempts of the plaintiff's bar to essentially weaponize some of the laws. This is the private right of action in CCPA for breach, but also the state UDAP laws and the wiretap laws, to try to go after basically the ad tech environment in a video context or in an online context. So
I agree.
It's definitely a trend.
The thing that caught my ear, Omer, is sensitive health information in the context of BetterHelp was either an IP address or an email address. That's a pretty broad theory definition of sensitive health information that then depends on context.
It is.
And that's one where you could build a pretty broad set of class actions if that's the theory.
Yeah,
anyway,
the theory was that the fact that some counseling is a sensitive issue, thereby making it sensitive health information. Yeah.
Any reaction, Shannon or Charlie?
I've definitely seen an uptick in wiretap litigation in relation to session replay technology. It's so easy for the plaintiff's bar to identify. You go to a website and you look at the trackers, it's super easy to figure out who is doing it wrong. So it's just easy. And I think, I know that we have tons of class action litigation right now in relation to SEPA, and I think it's only going to increase through this year.
Yeah, I think the increased relevance and litigation around even legacy stuff. You were talking about Wiretap Act. I mean, what about VPPA, right? Like, goes back forever. It goes back to, it goes back to a Supreme Court justice who may or may not have rented inappropriate material, or a potential Supreme Court nominee who may have rented strange material. But like, that kind of litigation will absolutely go on. BIPA, strong one, litigation, just left, right, and center. I do wonder in your interpretation, particularly in the click tracking stuff, are we going to see folks centering more around the sensitive categories, what we'd call sensitive categories in Europe? So, the PHI universe, the Better Health, the Good RX, all that. Or are we just going to see it ubiquitously? And if we see it ubiquitously, right, every ad tag fire is a breach. How many courts do we need to handle this in any constrained timeline?
No, I agree with you, Charlie. I don't know. I mean, to me, there's a context element to it. It's just, and you kind of know it when you see it, like BetterHelp. You look at what the website does and the fact that they were sharing it when you landed on different kinds of mental health issues. That's like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. But you can imagine going down the line and it's going to be a little bit more vague about whether it's sensitive health information in context. I think it is going to be, I don't think it's going to be like everything is there, but I think there's going to be a lot broader use of that theory. And I think it could actually succeed a lot more if the FTC really pushes this, like the sensitive health information side of it,
Could I add
Yeah.
what I think might be the potential sensitive categories that would be in target?
Oh, yeah.
We know health data, right? That's been borne out in the panel today. Biometric data and children's data.
Well, location is the other one that came up, like almost anything with location. And, again, I want to be sensitive to time. You guys covered a lot. I always love seeing this group. It's just a phenomenal group and we covered a lot. So I want to thank you all. Thank you, as always, friends of Spokes, for coming. And that allows me to do my second prediction or my third prediction, which is we will have a new EU-US framework in place with an adequacy decision within 5 months. I'm going to put some pressure on it, 5 months. And we're going to have two speakers coming up next who will be able to give us a little bit of insight into the process under the new framework. But any reaction to that? We'll have it before.
In 5 months and 1 day, it will be challenged.
What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's been really thought through in great detail. And I don't think that's going to at all protect it from challenges.
I'll defer to Alex and Bruno on this.
You're not going to go? Okay, perfect segue. Okay, thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Jeff.
And why don't we, quick round of applause. Thank you guys. And why don't we go in straight into our next panel?